please, Hiroshi Maeno, Inscriptions inside a hypogeum located in a suburb of Tyre. Please.
Hello, my name is Hiroshi Maeno. I'm from Hiroshima, Japan. My topic is inscriptions inside a hypogeum located in the suburb of Tyre. The hypogeum is located in Burj al-Shimali. Around here. And the dimension is here. It's named T01 by a Japanese archaeological mission led by Yoichi Nishiyama, a conservation art scientist, then professor of Nara University. He researched and conserved it from 2009 to 2011. 10 inscriptions of 4 types were found inside the hypogeum. Number 1, Tarsi udis thanatos, duo ecus triacosioi. Number 2, Haile lucis pantes tunetoi. Number 3, topos. And number 4, alpha. These inscriptions were already reported briefly, except for the number 4, alpha. I think that the alpha is the key to understand the characteristic of this hypogeum. Before we go into the inscriptions, let's have a look at the plan of T01. There are 3 zones. The yellow zone consists of the steps, the door, the floor mosaic, and a stone table in the center. The green zone consists of 6 graves surrounding the stone table. I number them 1 to 6 anti-clockwise. And the blue zone consists of the mural paintings. They were divided into 12 scenes. I numbered them 1 to 12, also anti-clockwise. It is clear that the hypogeum is of the triclinium type. Now, as for the inscriptions, number 1, Tarsi udis thanatos, duo ecos triacosioi. Courage, blah, blah, blah. Nobody is immortal, 322. This is drawn on the floor mosaic. It is a very common phrase. The letters were arranged in a square. Unfortunately, the far side is broken and the personal name there is missing. The number 322 is a year in the Julian calendar, which is 196-7 AD. Because this inscription is located at entrance, this year should be the construction date of this hypogeum, and the deceased with missing name must have been buried first. Number 2, Haile lucis pantes tunetoi. Farewell, Lucis, everybody is mortal. This phrase is quite rare. It is painted on the wall in scene 1 above Lucis' portrait. According to a paleosteological research, the deceased in grave 1 was male, age 40 to 60 years old, and the date of death between 336 to 437 AD. In comparison with other data, it is safe to say that Lucis was the last person to be buried in this hypogeum. The mural paintings seem to tell a story. The story starts from scene 1, farewell Lucis. This is his departure. Then a gallant food, gallant food, gallant food, gallant sequence continues until the peacock on scene 10. Peacock is said to be a symbol of resurrection in early Christianity. This might be his goal. I think that the whole mural paintings were drawn at the time of Lucy's death. Number 3, topos. Must be topos, meaning a grave. But strangely, there is a space between to and pos. Another strange thing is that the inscription on scene 4 and scene 9 has nail holes on the left, right, and below. A piece of nail still remains in the left hole of scene 9. Some people say that these holes were used to fix a tabula ansata, a wooden nameplate, in front of the grave, but this cannot explain the space between to and pos. I think that there used to be something in front of the inscription, for example, a lamp stand. The holes were used to fix it, and the space was made to avoid lampstand overlapping the inscription. These inscriptions were painted below the garlands. The positioning of these inscriptions seems to be suitable for lightening the whole dark interior. Number 4 and the final inscription, alpha. This type has been neglected by scholars. At my first sight, I thought that they were modern graffiti, but I recognized a regularity. All the alphas were scratched below the garlands. 2 of them were scratched above topos. Excuse me. Above topos. Looking like an adjective. It is known that an alpha was used as an abbreviation of hagios, which means holy. If so, this inscription should be read as holy grave. Therefore, at least the deceased in graves 1, 2, 3, and 5, 1, 2, 3, and 5 could be martyrs. The last question is why these alphas were scratched, not painted. My speculation is as follows. The owner of this hypogeum was also a Christian, and he himself scratched them, hesitating to order a pagan painter to paint holy. There might still have been tensions between the Christians and the pagans in Tyros when the mural paintings were made. Select bibliography is as follows. Thank you for listening.
Rothstein, Phoenician oral poetry.
Thank you. All right. Similarities between Mesopotamian and ancient Greek and even Roman poetry may be the result of cultural contacts. But how could the geographical and linguistic divide have been bridged? It has been suggested that Phoenician speakers may have played an intermediary role, but this suggestion immediately prompts another question. Was there such a thing as a Phoenician literature? Most people in this Congress would probably answer with an enthusiastic yes. The spread of thousands of inscriptions across the Mediterranean, even if most of them are short and formulaic, the material evidence for archives and correspondence, a documented vocabulary pertaining to the scribal profession, the references to a literary output found in Greek and Roman authors are all clear evidence of a lost Phoenician literature. However, many of my colleagues, classicists, will only be persuaded by a proper piece of evidence, that is to say, a literary papyrus. That's what happens when the issue is approached from the vantage point of view of hyper-textualized cultures. But in antiquity, literature conceived as written texts is just the tip of the iceberg. What about the effects of poetry that may have never been written down? Today I would like to briefly argue that we need to try and recover aspects of the lost Phoenician oral poetry, a task I hope to explore together with specialists from a range of disciplines, drawing on available material and textual evidence in a long-term historical perspective. We can make a case in favor of Phoenician oral poetry by means of deduction. Indeed, archaeology and material culture reveal organized communities whose members must have worked, loved, married, put their children to sleep, prayed, mourned their dead. As in many pre-literate cultures, they must have accompanied some of those actions with chanting, reciting, or singing. Poems and songs were presumably transmitted from one generation to another without ever being written down. We do have evidence for a Phoenician song culture. Vases, terracotta figures, and seals display musicians, dancers, and musical instruments known also in the neighboring cultures: lyre, double flute, tambourine, and cymbals. Musicians represented are often female, as Garcia Ventura and Lopez Bertrand have shown. Music playing probably implies some singing. A 5th century BCE accounting list from Kition possibly mentions singers among professionals to be rewarded. I am a classicist. For many years, I worked on Greek and archaic poetry, and I must say the picture I just drew is not very different from what we have for the song culture of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. It is to this time that we date Homer and others, but the full body of text comes from manuscripts written over 1600 years later. The early written evidence tells us very little. We are happy to distinguish an hexameter in the famous Nestor's cup, or perhaps a verse in iambic rhythm in a drinking cup from Methone. But we would never infer from them the complex songs that we believe were sung at the time, such as the Iliad or the Odyssey. The hypothesis that the Homeric poems and much early Greek poetry were orally performed and perhaps even composed in performance has achieved the virtual force of an axiom, but it came from outside the corpus of ancient evidence, from comparison with the living oral South Slavic poetry. And I truly wonder, why should we not take a similar comparative path for Phoenician oral poetry, only in reverse? For early Greek oral poetry, we have the end of the story in the form of medieval manuscripts supported midway by literary papyri. It is with the aid of a theory born from comparison that we join the dots between what poems say about performance, statements by later writers such as Herodotus and Plato, visual evidence, and material culture. Now, for the Phoenician oral poetry, we don't have the end of the story, namely a manuscript literary tradition, and therefore we lack later insiders' reports. But we have something like a beginning. We have the early stages of the tradition, the surviving poetry written in cognate Northwest Semitic languages. Combined research on Ugaritic and ancient Hebrew poetry yielded a deeper understanding of the main features of Canaanite poetry. Moreover, Ugaritic and Hebrew poetry, in the light of both the oral formulaic hypothesis and comparative ethnography, are often seen as originating themselves from an oral background. To be sure, two formal features may be linked to orality. First, the recurrence of fixed pairs of words, such as day and night, heavens and earth, give ear and hear, which are sometimes considered the equivalent of Homeric formulae for oral composition. Second, parallelismus membrorum, that is, the structuring of poetry in short units made of two or more phrases corresponding in sound and syntax, similar or antithetical in sense, a feature found in many living oral poetic traditions. An example from Hebrew poetry: give ear, heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Word pairs and parallelismus membrorum are characteristic of other ancient Near Eastern poetic traditions too. They are fantastic mnemonic devices, aiding as they do both comprehension and communication. Furthermore, as the history of the Bible translations proves, parallelismus membrorum is a highly translatable feature, easily adaptable from one language to another. It would be only reasonable to infer that Phoenician poems, songs, hymns, prayers, incantations were similarly structured. And indeed, scholars familiar with Semitic poetic traditions, Stefan, Avishur, and others, have found traces of poetic style in the older and longer Phoenician inscriptions. An example from the Eshmunasar inscription: for every king and every man who will open what is above this resting place, or will lift up the coffin of my resting place, or will carry me away from this resting place. In addition, traces of parallelismus membrorum have been found in the cosmogonic sections of Philo of Byblos, for example, and from this came all the sowing of creation and the birth of all things. But isn't it a little bit paradoxical to try to reconstruct oral poetry using written texts? Well, that's what we do with many other ancient oral traditions. To borrow an analogy suggested by my colleague Noam Mizrahi in Personal Communication, Phoenician oral poetry may be compared to dark matter, which is not directly observable, but without which many cultural phenomena of the ancient world cannot be adequately explained. End of quote. What is it that I would like to explain? I have my own personal agenda. I am looking for the missing link. Why do we find so few instances of a parallelistic style in Homer, but so many in Hesiod, including word pairs or polar expressions? Just one example from Hesiod. For the earth is full of evils, and full is the sea, and some sicknesses come upon men by day and other by night. Moreover, why do we find something similar to parallelismus membrorum centuries later in Virgil? Once every 10 lines, as my own research suggests. Two examples from the eclogues that I will skip. To conclude, Phoenician speakers were at the right places and at the right times to act as agents in cultural interactions between Greeks, Romans, and the East. That must have included oral forms of poetic expression. A variety of channels were indeed available: merchants, mercenaries, itinerant artisans, bilingual poets, musicians, or scribes, and also through intermarriage in families blessed with bilingualism. I would like to know more about Phoenician-speaking wet nurses and child nurses, most probably slaves or former slaves, raising children of Greek and Latin-speaking families, and think about the possible transmission of poetic patterns in early childhood. The notions of cultural interaction I entertain here may not perhaps enlighten similarities among high genres of literature, but they could explain how certain motifs and discursive patterns may have taken root. Thank you very much.
Of Piotr Głogowski, the development of the epigraphic culture of Phoenicia.
First of all, thank you for having me today, and thank you for creating this wonderful opportunity to share our knowledge and experience. Together with developing of their own writing system and literacy, the Phoenicians produce a substantial number of inscriptions that are one of the most important sources for exploring their culture. Like some other ancient Mediterranean people, the Phoenicians left a substantial number of so-called monumental or lapidary inscriptions. For example, commemorative texts like epitaphs, religious dedications, or building inscriptions that were very often intended for display. The practice of manufacturing such items can be called, using the terminology coined in classical studies, epigraphic culture. Today, it is very often estimated that there are approximately 10,000 Phoenician Punic texts spread all over the Mediterranean. However, we need to remember that in many of these places, Phoenician Punic inscriptions were very often just a part of more complex multicultural epigraphic landscapes that continued to live and develop throughout the ages. It is debatable then how justified is discussing those Phoenician Punic texts in separation from these local, multicultural, and diachronic contexts. By recognizing the necessity to take into account these three factors, in this paper I would like to discuss briefly the epigraphic culture of the Phoenician mainland and how it developed. Before that, however, two important points have to be made. Firstly, what is the local dimension of the epigraphic landscape of Phoenicia? For the purpose of this paper, Phoenicia is understood as an area of the Levantine coast extending from the eastern slopes of Mount Carmel in the south to the city of Marathos in the north. The study includes the most important Phoenician cities, for example, Arados, Byblos, Berytos, Sidon, and Tyre, and their immediate spheres of influence in the hinterland, namely Heliopolis and the Bekaa Valley, Upper Galilee, and the northwestern slopes of Mount Hermon. Secondly, we need to define what is understood as an epigraphic evidence. In this research, it is proposed to understand the epigraphic evidence as alphabetic, both Semitic and Greek-Latin commemorative inscriptions somehow intended for display. This leads us to exclude these kinds of evidence that bear writing of quotidian nature, for example, economic ostraka, bullae, amphora handles, and so on. Items that occurs in considerable numbers and to take into account texts carved and displayed in stone or metal, as well as mosaics and clay objects, if they meet this first condition. It is the building dedication or whatever could be displayed in public. The essence of this problem can be displayed on the example of the two most likely contemporary texts. While the inscribed stele of Jehavamilk can be taken into consideration for the present study, the ostracon from Akko is to be refused. For this study, we have to understand the epigraphic evidence as a cultural phenomenon distinct, although related, from phenomena like literacy, and to consider the quantitative aspect of the epigraphic evidence. In fact, the development of the epigraphic culture can be traced according to a number of criteria by tabulating the available evidence within the chronological framework. Such a tabulation can be performed using cumulative diagram charts labeling particular characteristics of the evidence. Such a method, commonly used in modern epigraphic studies, provides us with an opportunity to juxtapose a massive evidence and to distinguish particular cultural processes taking place within the phenomenon throughout the ages. Here I would like to just to show you a bunch of sources of our information about the epigraphy of Phoenicia in the Greco-Roman period and in Phoenician period and so on. We do not have the comprehensive corpora still, and we are just working on this dispersed evidence. These list very long, and that's only for Semitic. And here we also have for the Greek evidence is unfortunately not very, it's only very selective. There's a lot of separate publications spread over the journals. Yes. From Phoenicia, we have roughly 2,600 inscriptions dated to the time span from almost 17th centuries that can be divided according to their language and typology. However, only around 1,000 of them can be dated accurately enough to be included within this study. It is noteworthy that the percentage of datable inscriptions vary according to the language. The Semitic inscriptions are far more likely to be dated than the Greek and Latin ones. We can distinguish several categories of texts due to their function. They are funerary texts, religious dedications, honorific inscriptions, so-called inscriptions forestières, and other, less common types labeled as other. It is noteworthy that Phoenicia lacks one of the most common types of inscriptions in the Greco-Roman world, namely decrees. We can propose two basic tabulations of the evidence. The first illustrates the linguistic dimension of the phenomenon. We can see processes like the continuity of the indigenous language as a means of epigraphic expression as long as the late Hellenistic period, the emergence of Greek in the Persian times, and its takeover as a major language of the epigraphic culture as early as the 2nd century BC. We can also notice the sudden appearance of Latin, most attested in the Roman colonies of Berytus and Heliopolis, and its maintenance as long as the 4th century CE. I'm sorry. I think I just pressed twice the same. Sorry. Another tabulation deals with the evidence according to the type, what provides us with an opportunity to formulate some general conclusions regarding the nature of the development. While first centuries of the practice are typologically poor, including merely dedications and epitaphs, the Hellenistic and Roman times enriched the epigraphic expression mostly by introducing Greek-like types of inscriptions like honorific texts, tituli honorari. After the 4th century CE, you can observe the rapid growth of texts labeled as other. They are mostly new Christian and late antique categories of inscriptions like church texts, biblical quotations, acclamations, and so on. Thus, we can distinguish three distinct stages of the development of the phenomenon, being the indigenous Phoenician, second, Greco-Roman pagan, and third, late antique and Christian in nature. And I have provided you with some examples of how rich culturally is the epigraphic culture of Phoenicia. We have, for example, Cypriot dedication, most likely from Bostanes Sheikh, as early as the 5th or the 4th century BC. Sorry. We have the Phoenician text from Wasta, which is, in Greek letters, but in Phoenician. The last text in Phoenician is the bilingual inscription as a dedication by a gymnasiarch from the 1st century BC. And we also need to remember that Phoenician is not the only Semitic language of the region. Unfortunately, the Aramaic texts are not so numerous. We have only half a dozen of specimens I know of. Usually they are from Greco-Roman period. We have also a very strong sign of continuity, cultural continuity, which is expressed also in other languages, not only in Phoenician, for example, Latin dedication for the local Phoenician divinity. The question that can be asked is how structurally unique was the epigraphic culture of Phoenicia? The answer can be provided only based on a wide-range comparative project, and some work has already been done within the epigraphic culture project conducted within the University of Wrocław. A significant portion of the Eastern Mediterranean has been covered to perform a similar study. However, what is especially advisable is to seek an opportunity to compare Phoenicia with some other Levantine regions. In fact, I currently conduct such a project dealing with the epigraphic culture of Judea and Palestine and hope soon to be able to deliver some further observations in that respect. In conclusion of this paper, I would like to underline the importance of epigraphic culture as a subject of research in its own right and a valid analytical tool. As it was proposed, by adopting such perspectives, it is possible to explore the cultural development of particular societies in wide chronological boundaries and to address the problems of change and continuity. However, in order to do that, for practical reasons, it is very often necessary to focus on the local dimension of a given society. By constructing the epigraphic landscape, one also needs to take into account the multilingual evidence. This creates an excellent opportunity to overcome the usual research limitations, especially notorious in the case of multicultural societies. Phoenicia, with its culturally diverse epigraphic landscape, is certainly such a case. In fact, by adopting this approach, we can see that the region produced a long-lasting practice of inscribing stone that reflected the major cultural trends and influences that had an impact on the local societies. This is clearly visible in the fact that it is possible to distinguish three major and distinct stages of this development of this culture. However, as usual, this analysis provides us with far more new questions than answers. One of them is, how common are the dynamics represented in the epigraphic culture of Phoenicia? The obvious fields for comparison was, as I said, Judea and Palestine, inhabited by other important indigenous Semitic peoples. Thank you so much for attention. Sorry for extending. Thank you.
Completely different, Dr. Garland. Missing letters, words and phrases, recovering meaning from formulae evocative descriptions.
Okay. Today I'm going to talk to you about nothing, about gaps, about things that are missing from Phoenician inscriptions. I've been collecting votive formula, looking for patterns and skipping small fragments, but I discovered some stele, perfectly formed, complete, that had one single large letter inscribed. Not a fragment, just one letter, alone and complete by itself, with everything else missing. But why? How do we fill in those gaps? How do we study what's missing? Today I'll move from the general and the complete, and the longer, the better known, to the specific and the abbreviated. We have regularly occurring phrases with specific syntax, a certain rhythm, but these phrases may be omitted, so they leave a gap. Next, at the level of word, we look at nouns in the predicate nominative. Finally, we'll see terms abbreviated with just one initial letter. At each of these levels, certain clauses, words, or characters have to be supplied in order to make sense of the expression. We start on Cyprus with longer, complete inscriptions. This votive dedication, bilingual in both Phoenician and Syllabic Greek, allows us to compare at the phrase level. Scholars have applied the dovetail to Greek hexameter verse. Here, I'll apply the dovetail metaphor to semantic units. In Homeric studies, the dovetail applies to formulaic cola. Certain expressions fall in certain regular positions, and we can join to other parts. They can join to other parts of the verse at regular intervals. I'm not suggesting direct comparison to poetry in the Phoenician inscriptions, but they do have a certain poetic parallelism. The predicate nominative repeats in gray. It's a statue that he gave to Reshef. It's a gift that he vowed because the God heard his prayer. A repetition of the predicate nominative. Do note the ellipsis in the Greek version. No temporal clause, no repetition of the predicate nominative, no causal clause. The Phoenician version is complete. The Greek has semantic units elided, yet I would argue the Greek carries the same meaning. Here, a second Cypriot inscription that I'm using just to show how clauses and words could be marked. Punctuation and line breaks rather than just a continuous script. It suggests a sense of word and clause boundaries. We sometimes have poetic parallel predicate nominatives. But instead of repetition, the predicate nominative is most commonly omitted. The noun is missing. The main clause of the votive expression, gone. The core of the sentence missing, yet the meaning must be understood. This bilingual from Malta. In both languages, the main clause, predicate nominative, is omitted. The verb of the relative implicitly carries the weight of the predicate nominative. They vowed something, the votive which they vowed. Repetition of the predicate nominative may be poetic, but not efficient. The predicate nominative sometimes filled one slot, sometimes filled two, but was most often missing. Gap filled easily but generically. Vowed was a vow, given was a gift, erected was a stele. The expression can be understood despite the elision of the predicate nominative. Taken to an extreme, the ellipsis can leave just the dedicant's name or the action or product of their votive. The final stage, from generic to specific, concerns certain cases where absolute minimal expression still allowed for comprehension. Beyond the extreme of 1 or 2 words, we have some, a few, or 2, or even 1 letter. I want to make a couple of alphabetic points. First, in Phoenician, alphabetic script, from the beginning and by design, employs elision. Semitic inscriptions did not and do not require vocalization for contemporary fluent readers. Intermediary vowels normally go unmarked. So a single consonant implies a vowel. My second alphabetic point relates to initialism. Abbreviation marks only the first consonant. The letter form stands for its initial sound. The ach of alf, you can see this in our earliest known forms of Phoenician alphabet found in the Sinai, where the alf sign more clearly resembles an ox. So a single letter implies the word. With that in mind, let's turn to Carthage, where a single precinct has provided the vast majority of the surviving Phoenician Punic corpus. One sanctuary dedicated to Tanit and to Baal provides more than 90% of the inscriptional corpus in the CIS. Some elided clauses, some elide the predicate nominative, some have iconographic symbols but lack the inscription entirely. So, whoops, tried to use the pointer. So some lack an inscription entirely, and some lack any kind of iconography. Some lack even symbols, but all derive from the very same precise context, all serve a very similar function, marking votive offerings. But even when inscribed, their expressions are rigidly formulaic. We spend all too much time in the very center of the Venn diagram, here where we have something specific mentioned. But those complete expressions, because those complete expressions must provide meaning for the gaps and omissions. We've been moving from the general to the specific, and now we've arrived at the specific. But even here, I'll move from the complete and the known to the incomplete and unknown. Specifically, I'll look at complete dedicatory inscriptions with additional symbolic use of alphabetic characters. Then look at inscriptions with symbolic alphabetic characters standing alone. CIS 399 ends with a double aleph centered on the field above a bottle symbol. In this case, the aleph could be the initial of the dedicant, the personal name Adonibal, son of Aderbal. The initials could invoke the divine epithets of Lord Baal Adir, Adon Adir, but that's more common in Kirta. Or this could be the epithet of Baal Hamon, boxed in the inscription here, invoked twice in poetic repetition. Adon, Adon, my Lord, my Lord. Other uses of single letters have a central place in the decorative field, above or within or surrounding other symbols. On El Hafra 170, the beit sits in the acroteria above the so-called sign of Tanit. This could be an initialism for the personal name of the dedicant that's in the inscription below, Baal Hano, or more likely for the deity Baal. The use of solitary beit as a symbol for the divine name best fits other markers without full inscription. The alphabetic symbol is equal to or incorporated within the so-called sign of Tanit, or equal to the bottle figure. Sometimes also we find the Tav alone, symbolizing Tanit, centered in the decorative field. At other times we find the divine initials Beit and Tav framing the symbols. So some inscriptions likely preserve the initial of the divine name or epithets, symbolic alphabetic signs. Other alphabetic inscriptions prove more challenging. Jean-Baptiste Chabot saw a system of contractions, preserving initial and final characters. For example, A chet and a lamed would stand for Hannibal, in the same way that a W and an M stands for William. But I hesitate to follow his method. Maybe I can't imagine a name interrupted by a bottle sign or a sign of Tanit or Caduceus mid-abbreviation. I find Chabot's system more ingenious than convincing. But why would deities need to be memorialized? The divine names could readily be supplied by their position in the precinct. So I may be wrong. Maybe the personal name needs to be recorded. In this example, 4477, the initial and final characters of the dedicants' names would fit the alphabetic characters as Akbar. But I may be right. Here on 397, we find 5 symbolic characters written within the sign of Tanit that match neither the divine name nor personal name. Fully intact stele with symbolic characters found in decorative fields without accompanying inscription defy ready interpretation by me. Yet their ancient context, a native speaker must have read their symbolism, read their meaning. In any case, symbolic decorative use of alphabetic characters likely preserves initialisms best understood in context as one moves from the general to the specific, from the known to the unknown. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much.